Thank you very much, Mick. Lauren noticed she was very nervous about speaking to a group like this because she'd never spoken to such a group before. I have spoken to over 100 farmers before, and I understand why she's very nervous. It's particularly when they're cane growers. But anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be able to address tonight's dinner of the Australian Farm Institute's Roundtable on Australian Agriculture. Australia as the food bowl of Asia, sorting myth from reality, is the topic. So it's sort of wonderful to be back in Sydney again after even a short time away, where I've been exploring agribusiness growth throughout Asia. In fact, it's a little strange to now be back at Australian agriculture, looking at it from afar. It feels a bit like the quote of T.S. Eliot, which said that we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So tonight I'll try and give you an insider's view, looking back from the outside, on Australian agriculture and its role as a food bowl to Asia. I think as all of you who travel in Asia know, that the one thing that strikes you about coming back here is just how calm Australian capital cities seem by comparison. In fact, it's a bit like going back to Orange at the weekend after spending a week in Sydney. It's also wonderful to be talking to an audience who might actually get my jokes. This is in contrast to the looks I get in our animal feed business in China, when I joke about the margins being paltry or our venison feed being too dear. And the dairy farmers both here and in New Zealand at least chuckle at the image when someone mentions a pat on the head. But tonight's topic's serious, and I know you're thinking, I hope his talk is better than his jokes. So for the next 2 to 3 hours, no, seriously, I'll keep it brief, but let me start by just updating you on Zulik and its agriculture business. Zulik's, as Mick has already said, is a private family-owned business, and sales are actually now around 14 billion, mainly in Asia-Pacific and predominantly in healthcare, but with significant agriculture interests. Goldcoin is an animal feed business that operates with 25 mills in 9 countries throughout Southeast Asia and China. And in this area, Zulik owns CB Norwood, which is a farm equipment business in New Zealand and Australia. And we also have a nutraceuticals business in the USA. But returning to the question tonight, can Australia be the food bowl to Asia? Actually, I think it is of itself perhaps rather presumptive and even grandiose, frankly. If I may be the devil's advocate for a moment, and I'll give you something to pause about as you contemplate dessert, I'd offer some possible responses. Firstly, who cares? Is Australian agriculture relevant either in Australia or overseas? Is it more a case of Australia being a dust bowl rather than a food bowl? Are we an exporter only because no one lives here? i.e. a big empty country that gets no rain? Are we just lucky that tectonics have happened to dump this big dry landmass of ours a long way from our origin, which was once joined to Africa, and placed us a lot closer to Asia compared to our agri-competition of USA or Brazil? So do I have your attention? Good. Now let me try and pull apart this straw man I just created. Firstly, who cares? What is Australia's own interest in our ag sector? Is the Australian agricultural sector becoming irrelevant to the economy? Now, I don't know if anyone else here can remember 1965, and it's a long room, so someone down the back may, but it was when the Beatles released Yesterday, The Sound of Music opened, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia, and the US was bombing North Vietnam, which, by the way, is a little ironic in that Goldcoin now owns a successful feed company in Hanoi. It's called the American Feed Company. In 1965, farms made up 60% of Australia's export merchandise. That was 1.9 billion of the then total export merchandise of 2.7 billion. Just 10 years later, agriculture made up less than 50%. And now, a further 30 years on, the share is down to 14%. This significant and continuous fall sounds grim, but the farm contribution is now worth $32 billion, and Australia's total export merchandise value has grown to around $250 billion. So despite its relative decline at 32 billion, I think that agriculture is hardly irrelevant, at least in absolute dollar terms. In terms of people, in 1965, agriculture employed 400,000 people, which was nearly 10% of the total Australian workforce, which was then 4.7 million. Today, this has fallen to around 2.5% of the workforce, and in actual numbers is below 300,000 in a total workforce of now over 11 million. But to put that in perspective, according to the statistics at least, in mining it's still only around 2% at 200,000. That's just 2/3 of the number of people working in agriculture. And the story of Australian agriculture productivity is quite an amazing one. Fewer people are employed now than then. Exports have risen 16 times in value, and obviously since 1965 there's a lot of inflation in that. But in terms of farm volumes, which don't lie, the volume index, outputs have risen nearly 3 times. So we've got 3 times the output, 2/3 the people, and it says output per person on Australian farm has increased by 400%. And so no wonder there's no one in the streets of Orange. But that's huge gains, and if you can keep making that sort of advance, it looks like Australian agriculture will continue to find a way of staying around and being relevant, at least locally, for a while yet. But how relevant are we versus the rest of the agriculture world? We see ourselves as this massive farming continent, but I think it's simply because of our British ancestry, and compared to the UK, every country is quite massive. So let me try and put Australia's size and available farming area into perspective. Australia, as you all know, has a land area of around 7.7 million square kilometres, and I think that probably even includes Tasmania. But I know for sure because I actually went to the CIA website to get these statistics. Anyway, and it's an interesting website, by the way. Anyway, it says that the total Australian land area, only 6% is defined as arable. So that's probably plus or minus Tasmania, given the accuracy. But it doesn't matter, they're probably all greens down there anyway in farming terms. Anyway, this means Australia has potentially 468,000 square kilometres of useful land. So let's say 500,000 square kilometres of farms. As a continent, we are 30 times the size of the UK, with its 250,000 square kilometres of total land area. And even allowing for UK's percentage of arable land at 4 times ours, they have about 25% arable land, we still have 7 times more farming area. So I guess it looked pretty immense to the first settlers, particularly since they started with all the stuff that actually got rain. But let's look at the traditional big boys, Canada, Brazil and the USA. Canada, despite its size of nearly 10 million square kilometres, has only 4.3% arable land, giving the same net farm area as Australia. Brazil is a bit bigger than Australia in total area and has about 8% arable land, giving it 30% more farming area than Australia. And the rainfall in the main area, the Cerrado, can be 1.1 to 2 metres per year versus Australia's 500 millimetre average. As we all know, a fair chunk of Australia gets far less than that. The USA is also nearly 10 million square kilometres in area and has 16% arable land, twice the ratio of even Brazil, and a staggering 1.5 million square kilometres of arable land, nearly 4 times the size of Australia, with good rainfall and substantial irrigation. All of these are Australia's competitors into Asia. But it's only part of the story. Australia's agricultural relevance also has to be looked at in terms of Australia's own production, or Asia's own production, I should say. And in that sense, I have a question for you here. Can anyone here tell us which country has the largest area of arable land? Hear any names? Well, I think it's actually India. It has a land mass of only 3.3 million square kilometres, but at 53% arable land delivers a massive 1.75 million square kilometres of farms, larger than USA. The challenge in India, of course, is the size of the farm and achieving productivity. And I think farms offering scale and efficiency will be a long way off for India. But China itself is also a huge farmer, about the same total size as the USA and larger than Brazil or Australia. It has over 1.1 million square kilometres of arable land. And it's not just the potential size of these farming nations that we should be in awe of. The farm prowess is evident in the actual output. And let's look at wheat, where I at least had this image of us being a pretty dominant world player. Australia produces around 22 million tonnes of wheat in a reasonable year. Even the UK produces around 15 million tonnes. Germany produces more than 24 million tonnes. Canada produces about 26. USA and Russia 60 million tonnes. India produces 80 million tonnes. And China has been steadily growing and produced 115 million tonnes of wheat in 2010-11 and 120 million tonnes last year. So in terms of just this crop alone, we are really dwarfed by China. If this gets sufficiently scaled, perhaps Australia is not going to be the wheat powerhouse to the extent that we see ourselves. It is in exports where we hold our own. With only 20 million people to feed, Australia becomes relevant to the world market as it delivers over 10% of the traded wheat volume. We consume only 1/4 of our wheat domestically. But just pause for a moment. If Australia had just 4 times the population, to be at 80 million, which is still only 1/4 of the USA's, That means we'd have no wheat exports. The good news is that I think it'll be a little while before we reach 80 million people. By that time, even Orange will get busy. So we've been punching above our weight in ag, and I guess the question is, what will happen next? Traditional agriculture has meant small-sized farms which have been highly protected. By contrast, Australia opened up rapidly, protection has been stripped away, and bare-faced in the competitive winds of a free market, Australia now generally operates very efficient and low-cost farms. But Australia is still one of the few players on the supposed level playing field, and at times I think Australia may be the only player there, frankly. The rest of the world is also catching up or is caught up in efficiency and is scaling up into efficient and industrialised farming practices. These countries are building the scale of their ag businesses or have already built them, and we well know the traditional commodity giants of the ABCDs, i.e. the ADMs, Bunge's, Cargills and Dreyfus. The international consolidation they led had been largely focused on trade in Western countries. And frankly, I think that the rapid growth in consumption and production of new products in the Asian region caught even the big guys napping. Out of nowhere came Wilmar, built on Asian palm oil trade into China, and African and Asian trade made Olam a sudden commodity force. We've also recently seen the mega trader Glencore emerge to take out Canadian giant Viterra, who in turn had gobbled up ABB. And this is driven by the ability, indeed the necessity, to arbitrage by moving product from the nearest low-cost country to the markets. Sadly, in the midst of all this, I can't recognise many Australian ag companies that have become more than an exporter. We didn't see AWB grow into a global wheat trader from other origins to rival the ABCDs, or even CSR grow from being the largest sugar marketer in the region, nor did ABB extend beyond exporting. Many attempted forays into overseas markets have actually been somewhat disastrous, and even GrainCorp, who had started on a good international program, is now potentially being consolidated to ADM. By contrast, in New Zealand, Fonterra has done well in establishing overseas production bases, supported by an environment locally that recognises the national importance of the dairy sector. Indeed, the New Zealand currency fell on the back of their recent milk contamination scare for China. This doesn't change Australia's prospects as a local producer, but it does limit its role on the international stage. In my view, it's not too late to expand some sectors globally. But sizable Australian companies need to not only export to Asia, they need to also operate there and buy stakes in businesses on the ground. For example, I think our meat exporters need to also own stakes in local Indonesian abattoirs and ultimately participate in the cold storage chain. I mean, look how rapidly a family business from Brazil, JBS, the Batistas, have grown to form JBS Swift, one of the world's largest, if not the largest, meat packer. It's been tough for Australian businesses to do that. I know from experiences in both Goodman Fielder and CSR just how myopic the Australian investment community is when it comes to longer-term positioning versus short-term earnings. And it takes a long time and good balance sheet to grow in Asia. The competitiveness of the Australian market locally means there isn't a lot left over to fund growth planned in Asia. And culturally, there are many tough lessons along the way to adapt to Asian business practices and risks. The Zulik family did this over 3 generations, and our animal feed business, started in Singapore in 1953, has grown substantially in just 1. But Australia does have one other important agricultural export, perhaps not a commodity though. The booming Asian demand and hence growth in Asia's own ag sector has created a shortage of skilled people. That means that you meet a lot of Australian senior managers who are running ag industries there, generally for Asian companies who are building their broader management skills from traditional trading origins. In addition to its commodity base, very clearly Australia needs to increase its value-added food offerings. In this sense, we'll find it tough given the relative cost structures and scale of production in Australia. It will need high margin, hence premium products to compete effectively. Another option, quite simply put, is if you can't beat them, join them. And in that sense, I look forward to seeing the growth of Australian agribusinesses to be not only a food bowl to Asia, but also being on the ground in Asia. They should be participating actively as producers and marketers in the Asian economy. This, though, will need some foresight and some patience not exhibited to date by Australian investors, at least in the public companies. In the meantime, I think there is one thing that Australia needs to do regardless, and that's to economically increase the level of irrigation for farming to significantly grow output. It may not be as grandiose as another Ord River scheme or turning coastal rivers inland, but it may be things like simply expanding the Burdekin Dam, where in summer water that flows over the spillway, which is 1/2 kilometre in length, is over 1 metre high for days on end. All this in an arid continent, and yet in winter, even in the Burdekin, surrounding unirrigated land is too dry to sustain a crop. Or it could be as simple as actually allowing a farmer to actually put a dam in a creek, such as in Proserpine, where in the wet there's massive flooding, but dams are prohibited by what was the Environmental Department, although that's now being taken care of by the new Queensland government. So I think that Australia cannot afford to just sit on the veranda in an armchair and expect Asia to come looking for Australia to be its food bowl. Australia needs to take its skills to Asia and also to aggressively build its footprint there, as well as expanding its own local production output and infrastructure. Whether it is an Australian ag company or overseas player running the show, there will be a strong role for Australia in supplying food to Asia. But it would just be a bit nicer if it extended to actually running businesses on the ground there. Thank you. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Why is it that Australian companies have failed to become the ADMs of the world?
For the question, if you didn't hear that at the back, was why have Australian companies failed to become the ADMs of the world? And that's the, whatever it is, $500 million question. Some examples. In Goodman Fielder, I ran, as a division of Goodman Fielder, based out of the US, an ingredients business where we were the largest supplier of texturisers to the US dairy industry, and we had the largest edible gelatine business in the world. That was sold in order to fund Goodman Fielder's focus on its Australian branded business, which has since been really decimated by the attention given to it by Coles and Woolies. I think shareholders and investors, I've said, have a very local focus and one that doesn't really look at international investment. In CSR, when I was in the sugar business, we desperately wanted to get into Brazil. Back in 1996, Australia was second only to Thailand in its exports of sugar to Asia. We're the largest exporter in the region behind Thailand, who had this freight advantage. Brazil was down the tracks. 10 or 15 years later, Brazil is 10 to 20 times the size of Australia. And there was no interest in CSR taking part in that growth. I think we're seeing AWB have a bit of a disastrous journey into Brazil and lose money from not controlling derivatives. And one thing about the Brazilian, or doing work in Brazil that I can tell you about, is you certainly need to keep an eye on the till. So I think we're not good at running businesses offshore. We don't have an investment environment that actually recognises or values that. But it's disappointing. We should have those companies. I would also say if you take our wheat business, and we're probably leading in terms of wheat harvesting technology given the scale of our farms, but you can see that if we don't do something about participating in these big players overseas, we'll lose that edge as well. It won't take the rest of the world long to catch up. Technology moves quickly. So there are things we can do without necessarily being the biggest wheat producer, but why aren't we the biggest technology provider to the wheat industry globally?
Thank you. Where are the farmers? Where's the manpower of women power going to come for the farms? There's something. This essay that we congratulated today, this evening, points out that there's 700 agricultural graduates and about 4,000 jobs available to them, as compared, say, with dentistry, 580 dental graduates looking for 250 places. In other words, young Australians are really not interested in going on the land, or they can't afford to, and the agricultural colleges are falling down around their ears, aren't they? The state-funded agricultural colleges in Victoria are all in a terrible state of decline. The only one that's doing any good is the private one, and that's Marcus Oldham. So where you talk about exporting our technology, the people have got to be educated in the first place to be able to both service us here at home and then extend it abroad.
Oh, it's a good point, and that agricultural shortage of agricultural experience is very real. I mean, in CSR we had dreadful trouble going back into the market to recruit agricultural people. And why is that? Because there's such strong demand. There's certainly been less supply. Interesting enough, in Indonesia, when we hired some locals, we could hire people there for about $5,000 or $10,000 a year for well-qualified agricultural scientists. So I think the answer is where it's going to come from. It'll probably come from overseas. But that's not, again, a good reflection on what Australia is doing around that education sector. And again, I think there's been a gap where agriculture fell off. What was interesting, everyone went for mining, etc. I think we saw this downturn in Australians' sort of view of agriculture. You can see how significant it is and how we've seen this recovery in the underlying commodity price. But it also isn't the world's most profitable business, and it's hard to attract graduates to remote areas in businesses that aren't having the high margins. It's a tough existence. So I don't have the answer to your question, but I agree it's a real issue.
Ian, I'm Peter Carberry from CSIRO. I'm interested in, I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm not sure I got the answer to the question that's up on the board there. Is it a myth or reality?
Well, I think it's a myth that we are Asia's food bowl, and frankly,
Can I quote you?
Yes. And when I look at our own business and take the Gold Coin animal feed business, we are one of the largest players in Malaysia. We will buy their feed for poultry and for swine, with the two major areas of protein. We buy all the animals there are basically corn-fed or soybean, so we'll buy that clearly from the Americas, either from North America or from Brazil or Argentina. Australia does not feature as a supply in that whole protein chain through currently poultry or swine in any of the Asian countries. There's no wheat used. So where's Australia in that sense? Now, I actually still think Australia is very significant, and Australia has this image of clean and green, and there's no doubt if you go into Singapore and the premium meats you'll find will be Australian meat, and they'll sell for quite a substantial price above local stuff. So there's two markets. I think there's, like anything, firstly there's no one Asia. Secondly, there is no one flat market. It's very much pyramidal. You'll have the commodity scale, and we'll have to compete, and we'll continue to be very efficient to compete. But we're very small in terms of local supply. And you just look at the volumes versus the local production. Look at China, 120 million tonnes of wheat, of which probably 10 comes from Australia. So how relevant really are you there? At the same token, I think Australia can do a lot better in capturing what's this emerging middle class, and where there is probably a chance to compete with higher value added and hence cover the freight costs and even the labour costs in producing in Australia. So there are parts. Australia will be important in Asia. It won't be seen as its food bowl.
Follow up one.
We'll hold you and go back for a second.
Snow Barlow from the University of Melbourne. Ian, you made an aside along the way about...
Oh, there's a Tasmanian in the audience. I knew it would come back to bite me. If it helps,
my
mother is Tasmanian. It's okay.
No, not a long way from Tasmania. But about our journey as a free trader, and
Yep.
you know, we've taken leadership traditionally in the Cairns Group, and whether, you know, where has that got us in international trade in agriculture? Has it ultimately played against us? And you know, we still are a leader in free trade, particularly in agriculture, but is our lack of presence, has it got anything to do with our lack of presence in international agriculture and international agribusiness, the fact that we've taken this very hardcore economic approach to free trade and leading the Cairns Group?
It's a very good question. I don't know there's an easy answer. It's sort of one hand, other hand type arguments. It's true that in those industry sectors that deregulated most recently, i.e. dairy and sugar, we've probably done the least in terms of international competition. We've been very cost effective in those that deregulated earlier. But we also had a long period where we had these pooling groups and basically things like the AWB, it was Queensland Sugar and so on, where we had farmers, I think, conditioned to the fact that someone else will look after the market for them. They will take a pool price and all they do is worry about making sure they do better than a neighbour and getting yield. And I think that cost us dearly. I think the same token, that there is no doubt that those protected industries had built up higher margins. Certainly the sort of high margins in Europe and US behind tariff barriers allowed people to build up bigger war chests to go offshore. But you've got to come back to our total scale. Our industry is still very small, and I think that will always be the fundamental issue. The question is what stopped Australia really heading off and taking its expertise internationally? Why didn't Australia take its sugar expertise into Brazil and be part of the Brazilian sugar industry? Why aren't we part of the Canadian wheat industry instead of the other way around? So I think they're the questions that are tough to ask. I'm not sure it's about protection or complacency or what's caused that. It's a very good question.
We'll share around, we'll come back to you.
On that point, it's a sort of a rhetorical question, and that is, who won the Indonesian MasterChef, competition this year, and what did they cook? Do we really know what the Indonesian housewife is putting on her plate, and are we providing that, for her? So I think you've made a good point, Mick, about complacency, about proximity. Does it breed complacency? I mean, proximity is very powerful. If you use proximity as an advantage and actually get involved in what's going over there and understanding those cultures and what they need. And I really think, maybe you can comment. I mean, have we really taken the advantage of being close to Asia and really understanding what those cultures want in terms of food and products?
It's a good question. There's an example, again, at Goodman Fielder, when we used to have quite a large stake in cold storage holdings based in Singapore, and look at it now, such a successful retail chain. Also had bakeries, but the bakeries were producing Australian-style white bread, whereas in Singapore, bread is very much a sweet, a dessert. It's sweet and rich. So we were trying to force an Australian product down an Asian palate that didn't want it. So it does take a while, and that's the thing about venturing a new market. That's why it takes time and money, because you've got to get it right. You live and learn. If you're not on the ground, you won't work it out from here. So it's chicken and egg. Get on the ground, spend money, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, correct them and get there. You can't just expect to walk in one day. The advantage we have probably is that with the rapid rise in per capita income and this growing middle class, you're starting to get more identifiable Western trends in consumption, which means bringing sort of that palate of that section of the community closer to Australian style. That's where the wine industry is moving and so on. So there's some easier segments of the market to capture, and they're getting quite large where you can actually economically go into, say, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Beijing, Manila, some of these easier cities in which to do business and actually have probably more standard type products that are closer to what we're familiar with.
Hi, it's Bruce Watson, farmer, grain grower and Nuffield scholar. Just a question as a very loosely outsider looking back into Australia. What sort of sectors do you see us having sort of a comparative advantage in potentially, again, what your comments were feeding Asia, potentially 60 million people worth of exports versus 2+ billion people in Asia? And why do you think we have a comparative advantage in those sectors?
Well, I think we have, again, one of this whole shortage of labour has created a very efficient industry, and we know how to do things efficiently and in a mechanised way, which can reduce labour costs. And don't get me wrong, Asia has its labour cost problem. In China, we run robots on our packing areas because, at least in southern China, labour is incredibly expensive. So I think we have probably better knowledge than most in how to de-man, how to run things on a mechanised basis, and that's some of the, in fact we're talking tonight about cotton harvesting and shipping, which is done more efficiently here than in the US. It's a question of how do you leverage that. Then moving to the value-added sector, it's probably difficult, and I think the idea that we have Australian factories full of people producing fresh products and shipping them to Asia is probably not going to work. I mean, we see Woolies and Coles bringing in tin products from Vietnam and Thailand, and probably frozen fish, but it's quite a difficult supply chain either way. It makes just far more sense to be on the ground, and hence I mentioned what I think is an obvious one, and given all the issues you see here around livestock, be it sort of live sheep or live cattle and so on, you've got to control that supply chain, and that's probably one area we can move into on a mature and well-managed meat market. I think we've got some good experience on long supply chains and on good sort of frozen supply chain or chilled supply chain management. So there are some off-the-cuff areas. The wine industry is doing well. Treasury Wine Estates is on the ground and doing some good marketing out there now. There's probably a lot more in horticulture, but I'll let other people talk about that. I don't know too much about horticulture, I'm afraid.
Andrew Jacobs, the Australian Centre for Plant Functional Genomics. Ian, thank you for your talk. You talked about the fact that a quarter of our production is used domestically and that we export 3/4 of that, but that would only feed 2% of Asia, I believe. So not a massive contribution. We had the gentleman down the front talk about the fact that there's an increasing problem with getting people into the agricultural sector. Some people have suggested perhaps that technology is our greatest export in terms of contributing to world food security. If we're struggling to get people in, do you see any other area where Australia can contribute to world food security?
Yeah, I think there's still lots we can do. I mean, I think you've just got to go back and look at history. I'm sure if you sat in this room probably 15 years ago, many of the identical issues would have been on the table, and we've managed to continue to grow since then. I have a lot of faith in people younger than me to sort out those problems. I think, and it is diversified, and you get a lot of different stories from groups here. You talk about individuals who have actually got stuff on the ground in Asia. You hear about Sunrise doing it well locally. New Farm has done some great stuff in other markets. They've probably been more proactive than most. So there are some good examples. It's just they're harder to find. And I think, frankly, as a nation, we've been too complacent. Unlike the Kiwis, who have a small population, very hungry, and if you don't basically get some volume from outside, you won't make a decent living. Australia's been big enough that we're probably able to feed ourselves at a local market. We've lacked that, and it came up on the radio interview today, we've lacked that hunger and aggression to get in the markets, and I think we've just got to recreate that.
Ian, you talked basically about Australia in terms of its current footprint, and when I saw myth in the title, you know, there's this current myth and food bowl for Asia. Generally, that's the next sentence is Northern Australia, the development of Northern Australia, and so there is a view about there. Is that a myth or reality too? Do you have a view about the prospects there?
Yeah, if I was king for a day, what I would do is set up some economic zones where I could bring in. And this is probably heresy, but I bring in export workers, so the foreign labour type program that runs in a lot of the Asian countries. Because the problem in the north is we have this huge shortage of labour. We probably could do with some more dams, but it's a very expensive place to do business. It's isolated, transport costs are high, and a lot of that are due to remote sort of living areas and labour costs. But if you wanted to talk about food processing, and when I was at Goodman's many years ago, someone came up with this ideas of catamarans running fresh vegetables from Darwin into Indonesia. Somewhat fanciful, but you know, down the track, there's no reason why the rate Indonesia's going that Australia can't be a cleaner, greener manufacturing source, and the north end's closer than anywhere else. You take off from Papua on the far eastern end, and you land in Cairns in 5 minutes. So it's yeah, there's some great opportunities, but it's how do you do that in a practical sense? And I think just saying that we're going to suddenly set up a factory in Darwin, you're going to be really struggling to get the cost right. And then you say, well, why do I want to do that even in Darwin? Why don't I do it in Jakarta? And I'll have local people from here go over and do it on the ground and get my supply chain into Jakarta. Do it on the ground there. It's probably easier. So I don't think we have to do everything here, but we should be trying to control the supply chain.
Thanks. Mine was a similar sort of question about you're talking about development of the cold chain infrastructure in Indonesia with regards live export of cattle. Do you see that, you know, is that with a view to local processing of meat and then sending over the carcass?
Yeah, I think at the moment we seem to be victims in Australia of a supply chain we don't control. And so all this noise around, the way animals are slaughtered, etc., are being done to the industry by others. And you unless you control that, how do you get the reputation you need? Everyone talks about traceability. Traceability means knowing you can measure and control each step of the supply chain. And so if you really want to have Australian meat delivered traceably, you've either got to process it here, or if you're doing it overseas, you've got to actually ensure that whole supply chain through to the retail area is under control. And so to me, if I was a producer and my product's in someone else's hands, I'd want to have a say in that. You may not have to own it, but can you partner? Can you set up some joint ventures and use people on the ground to leverage your position in Australia?
Okay, we'll go with you as the last question.
I crave your indulgence. Andrew Farron's my name, I didn't mention it before. Leaving aside the Food Ball of Asia, but you mentioned the Cairns Group, or someone mentioned the Cairns Group. Decades ago, we were banging our head against the European agriculture policy and all that. Is the European market still of any particular agriculture relevance to us? And the thing that you think you'd learned from all this time is that the most successful country in looking after its agriculture interests in the world was France. And if we'd followed their policy, I think we might have been a lot better off and we wouldn't have banged our heads so hard and been so hurt all this time.
Yeah, I think there's two things in that. One, France has a lot larger population, and Australia is always going to struggle efficiently with a population of 20 million people and a forced level of exports. But there are success. When I was in the sugar industry, there was a group formed called the World Sugar Alliance, or Global Sugar Alliance, which included Brazil, India, who sort of were dabbling on the free market but liked it to be one way, not the other, and Australia and Thailand. And they were actually successful in getting action by the WTO against the European sugar exporters. And in doing that, the sugar price rose about 4 cents a pound in the region once we were able to stop the restitution and subsidies of exported sugar. So the little wins. It's going to take a long while. I mean, I think the people in the EU still believe the program has been a miraculous turnaround from famine post-World War II to this wonderful surplus. So what a fantastic system in creating this self-sufficiency and a huge sort of agricultural turnaround in production. I think though sooner or later in these tough economic times, people in the cities are going to get sick of subsidising that sort of indulgence when it isn't necessary. So it comes back to cost, and there's a lot of cost associated with these. And we're seeing the dairy industry starting to rationalise in Europe and so on, which we'll work it out because already people are starting to, the more efficient producers are going to sort of be jockeying for position. You'll see the less efficient disappear. So there's some hope. The US is not going to change for a long while, but again, here's US farm subsidy programs and things like ethanol programs in a country that's basically technically bankrupt. So how long can they keep doing this? Maybe the next generation that are sitting here will be saying the same thing.